The little girl burst through the glass doors of the corporate tower, her braids bouncing, her voice trembling but clear. The entire lobby froze as security cameras caught a truth no resume ever could. "Ma'am, please give Daddy his job back." Before we dive in, leave a comment and tell me, where in the world are you watching from? And don't forget to hit subscribe, because tomorrow's story will blow your mind. Jack Miller had learned to make himself small. 12 years of sweeping marble floors and polishing glass had taught him how to blend into the architecture, how to move without echo, how to carry silence like a second uniform. Orion Global never asked him to be seen. They only asked him to clean, and he did it with a quiet pride that no paycheck could measure. He knew which elevators hummed slightly off-key, which corners of the boardroom carpet curled at the edges, which hallways caught the late afternoon sun and gleamed like golden rivers when properly buffed. To the executives in $1,000 suits, Jack was invisible. To him, invisibility was survival. But survival isn't the same as security. He learned that on a Friday afternoon that smelled faintly of printer ink and disappointment. "Jack," his supervisor said, standing in the doorway of a small back office with frosted glass walls, "can you step in for a moment?" The room was colder than the hallway. On the desk sat a single folder, crisp, impersonal, already waiting. The supervisor didn't sit. He didn't look Jack in the eye. He simply pushed the folder forward with the kind of detachment that comes from following orders you don't want to admit you agreed with. Jack opened it, black letters on white paper, sharp enough to cut through 12 years of loyalty. Position terminated, effective immediately. His chest tightened as though someone had reached in and twisted his ribs. "There must be some mistake," Jack said quietly, careful not to sound desperate. "I've never been late. I cover shifts no one else wants. He stopped. The words felt too fragile in his mouth. The supervisor shifted uneasily. "It's out of my hands, Pirard," he murmured, the well-worn phrase of someone shielding himself from guilt. "Corporate is restructuring. They're investing in automation. Budget cuts, you understand." Jack didn't understand, or maybe he did, and that was worse. He understood that loyalty wasn't bulletproof, that invisibility, once a form of safety, could just as easily mean expendability. He stared at the paper, the ink already blurring under the weight of memories, the night shifts that kept him away from Lily's school plays, the holidays he worked to afford her Christmas gifts, the long hours polishing floors until they shone like glass so that others could walk in without noticing the work beneath their feet. He closed the folder gently, as if roughness might break what little dignity remained. "I still have bills," he said softly. But the supervisor was already glancing at his watch. The meeting was over before it had begun. By the time Jack stepped back into the hallway, Orion Global's walls seemed taller, colder, more indifferent than ever. He carried his box of belongings through the lobby, past the glass sculptures and polished steel that now mocked him with their permanence. His reflection in the marble floor looked smaller than he remembered. That evening, he walked home with Lily's hand in his. She was 6, her braids bouncing, her backpack decorated with stickers of stars and rainbows. She skipped beside him, humming a tune she'd learned in kindergarten. She didn't notice the way his fingers clenched around hers like he was holding on to the last steady thing in his life. "Daddy, can we get ice cream?" she asked brightly. "Not tonight, Bug," he said, forcing a smile. His voice cracked anyway. Lily tilted her head, studying him the way children do when they sense the weight adults try to hide. "Why are your eyes sad?" Jack swallowed, looking ahead. The city skyline was lit like a constellation, and in the middle of it all rose Orion Global, gleaming, powerful, unreachable. To everyone else, it was a symbol of progress, a tower of stars. To Jack, it was now just a reminder of the place that had decided he no longer existed. He squeezed Lily's hand tighter. "I'm just tired," he said. But as they walked beneath the neon lights and the hum of passing cars, Jack knew the truth. It wasn't just tiredness. It was the kind of emptiness that comes when the stars you've been cleaning for 12 years suddenly burn out, and you're left holding only the darkness. Children see more than adults ever intend them to. They catch the hesitations between sentences, the way a fork pauses mid-air, the sighs we think slip unnoticed. That night, the Miller apartment smelled faintly of garlic and tomato sauce, the kind of dinner Jack always made when money was tight, simple, filling, cheap. But the air around the table was heavier than the steam rising off the spaghetti. Jack twirled his fork once, twice, and set it down again. His plate sat mostly untouched. Lily chewed slowly, her eyes flicking from her noodles to her father's face. He was staring past her, into some place she couldn't see. The shadows beneath his eyes seemed darker tonight. His shoulders slumped in a way that made him look older than 39. She swallowed and set her fork down with careful purpose. "Daddy," she asked softly, "why are your eyes sad?" Jack blinked, as though her words had pulled him back from a cliff. He forced a smile that didn't quite reach his eyes. "Just tired, Bug. Long day." She didn't believe him, but she nodded. Adults liked to keep secrets, she had learned, and sometimes pretending to believe them was the only way to keep the peace. After dinner, Lily busied herself with her crayons, sketching a picture of her stuffed bunny sitting on a rainbow. She hummed quietly, pretending not to notice, as Jack stacked the unopened mail into a neat pile on the kitchen table. He smoothed the envelopes like he was ironing out wrinkles, but the crease in his brow only deepened. Later, when she snuggled beneath her blanket, Bunny pressed tightly to her chest. She heard the low murmur of his voice drifting down the hall. Jack had taken his phone into the kitchen, but walls in small apartments have thin skin. "I don't know how long I can keep the lights on without that job," he whispered to someone on the other end. "Rent's already late. Lily needs school supplies next month. I'll figure something out, but—" His voice cracked, quiet and raw. "I just don't know how much more there is to figure." Lily's small fists clenched around her bunny's ears. She didn't understand layoffs or automation or what a restructure meant, but she understood her father. He never let spaghetti go cold. He never sighed like that unless something was wrong, and he never, ever let her hear fear in his voice. Her chest burned with a feeling too big for her small frame. She didn't have the words for it yet, but she knew the shape of it. It was unfair. Unfair that her daddy, who worked harder than anyone she knew, was sitting alone with shadows in his eyes. Unfair that someone had taken something important from him, and by extension, from her. When she tiptoed to the kitchen an hour later, she found him slumped in a chair, asleep at the table. Bills were spread out like a storm around him, envelopes torn, numbers circled in red pen. His head rested in his hands as though he could block out the weight pressing down on him. Lily padded closer, her bunny dangling at her side. She studied the paper battlefield around him, but couldn't make sense of the numbers. To her they looked like angry scribbles, like a teacher grading with too much red ink. She wanted to push them all into the trash and tell him they didn't matter. But she didn't. Instead, she climbed carefully onto the chair beside him. She placed her bunny on the table between the bills, as if the soft toy could stand guard while her father slept. Leaning close, she whispered into the stillness of the room. "We'll fix it," she promised, her voice small but certain. "I'll help you, Daddy." "I promise." Then she pressed her cheek against the table, her tiny hand resting near his. Her eyelids grew heavy, but her resolve did not. In the quiet of that cramped kitchen, while Jack dreamed uneasy dreams of debts and deadlines, Lily dreamed of something else entirely, a way to fight unfairness with the only weapon she had, her courage. Victoria Hale lived in glass. The tower she commanded stretched above the city like a blade of light, every pane polished to a shine so sharp it seemed to cut the sky. Her office on the 50th floor was a cathedral of windows, where the city bowed beneath her feet in grids of headlights and steel. From the outside, she looked untouchable. And for years, she made sure that's exactly what people believed. Newspapers loved her. They called her Steel with style. A woman who could close billion-dollar deals in the morning and step onto a gala stage in the evening without smudging her lipstick. Magazine profiles framed her as proof that grit and ambition could rewrite destiny. She was the girl who grew up in a one-room apartment with a mother who cleaned houses and a father who disappeared before she learned how to tie her shoes. She had climbed from food stamps to Forbes lists by learning one lesson: never let anyone see you bleed. In meetings, she was precise. Her spine never bent, her voice never shook. In photographs, her eyes glittered with intelligence, but never warmth. The world admired her composure. What they didn't see was the silence that followed her home each night, the empty penthouse where her heels clicked against marble with no echo but her own. Her eyes, so quick to dissect contracts and detect lies, grew heavy when no one was watching. She carried her success like armor, and armor, by design, does not breathe. She didn't know Jack Miller's name. To her, janitors were numbers in a column, costs trimmed in the pursuit of efficiency. She never looked at the faces behind the uniforms, never paused to consider the hands that polished the glass she stood behind. Orion Global ran on systems, not sentiments. Every person in her building was a gear in the machine, and if one gear wore out, it was replaced. That was how the machine kept running. That was how she stayed on top. But sometimes, even the sharpest glass reflects something it cannot ignore. The day she signed off on the budget that cut Jack's position, she didn't hesitate. She didn't think of him walking his daughter home or of the bills spread across his kitchen table. She thought only of quarterly reports, investor calls, the relentless demand for growth. She clicked her pen, initialed the line, and moved on to the next agenda item. It was nothing personal. It was never personal. That's what she told herself over and over whenever the memory of her mother's raw hands came uninvited. Still, behind closed doors, Victoria sometimes felt the faint hum of dissonance. She could silence it with another deal, another accolade, another reminder that weakness had no place in her world. And yet, late at night, standing barefoot in front of the floor-to-ceiling windows, she would press her palm against the glass and feel the cold seep into her bones. The city glittered beneath her like a constellation, but constellations are distant. Stars don't keep you company. She believed she had built a fortress too high for anything to touch her. But fortresses have cracks, and sometimes it doesn't take an army to break them. Sometimes it only takes a child. Victoria Hale had no idea that a 6-year-old girl with fire in her eyes and a backpack slipping off one shoulder would soon march past her guards and into her office uninvited. She didn't know that her fortress of glass was about to tremble. She didn't know that a single voice, small but unflinching, could cut sharper than any headline, any boardroom betrayal, any rival she had ever faced. And when it happened, it wouldn't be the markets or the shareholders or the strategies that changed her. It would be that little girl reminding her, in the simplest words, of the truth she had spent her whole life burying. People are not budget lines, they are stories, and some stories refuse to be silenced. Monday mornings at Orion Global always had the same rhythm. The marble lobby echoed with heels striking the floor like metronomes, briefcases snapping shut, and voices pitched just loud enough to prove importance. Screens along the walls streamed stock tickers and news headlines, a constant hum of progress. It was a cathedral of commerce, and everyone inside played their part. The interns balancing coffee trays, the executives smoothing ties, the receptionists rehearsing smiles. Order, precision, control. Until 9:07 a.m. The revolving door spun awkwardly, catching the eye of no one at first, until a tiny figure pushed through with more determination than strength. Lily Miller stumbled into the lobby, hair messy, her school uniform wrinkled, a pink backpack hanging crooked on her small shoulders. She looked out of place against the towering glass and cold steel, like a watercolor smudge on an architect's blueprint. But she didn't falter. She marched forward, weaving past startled interns, her sneakers squeaking against polished marble. The security guard, Alan, frowned as he stepped from behind his desk. He had seen protesters, reporters, even a man once try to lead a goat through the lobby, but never this. "Excuse me, little miss," he called, his voice firm but kind. "Where are your parents?" Lily stopped, spun on her heel, and lifted her chin. Her voice was small, but it carried. "I'm here for the boss." "I need to talk to the ma'am who took my daddy's job." The air in the lobby shifted. Conversations broke mid-sentence. A dozen heads turned, then 2 dozen. Gasps rippled through the crowd as though someone had cracked the marble itself. Phones lifted. Cameras blinked alive. The spectacle too strange, too raw to ignore. Alan blinked, his hand frozen halfway to his walkie-talkie. "Sweetheart," he tried again, lowering his tone. "You can't just—" But Lily cut him off with a firmness far too big for her frame. "I won't leave until I see her." She clutched her backpack straps tighter, as if anchoring herself against the tide of staring eyes. "My daddy cleaned this place every day. He made it shine, and you let them take it away." Murmurs spread. An executive near the elevators muttered something about liability. A receptionist covered her mouth, eyes wide. A young intern whispered, "Is this real?" Above them, cameras swiveled silently, capturing every second. In the control room, a security officer clicked a button, and on the 40th floor, Victoria Hale's phone buzzed with an alert. Child disturbance in the lobby. Victoria was mid-meeting, her assistant standing at her elbow with a tablet of charts. She barely glanced at her phone at first. Disturbances were not uncommon, but when she tapped the feed and the screen filled with the sight of a 6-year-old girl standing alone in the middle of her empire, fire in her eyes, something inside her stilled. The boardroom's chatter blurred, meaningless. Back in the lobby, Alan stepped forward, unsure of protocol for children who staged revolutions. "Miss, you really can't—" Lily's voice trembled, but it didn't break. "Please," she said louder now, "give my daddy his job back. He says shiny floors mean people feel safe. Don't you want people to feel safe?" The words landed heavier than marble, heavier than steel. Phones caught every syllable, every flicker of defiance in her small face. And in that moment, the polished order of Orion Global cracked, just enough for something human to shine through. Alan lowered his hand from the walkie-talkie. Around him, the lobby wasn't buzzing anymore. It was holding its breath, waiting to see what would happen next. And upstairs, Victoria Hale, the woman made of glass and steel, stared at the screen and realized this was no disturbance. This was the beginning of a storm. It started as a shaky clip on someone's phone, a novelty in the middle of a Monday morning. A tiny girl in a wrinkled school uniform marching through the marble lobby of Orion Global like she owned the place. Security tried to stop her, but she stood her ground, chin lifted, fists clenched around the straps of her pink backpack. At first, people laughed. A child in the lobby was unusual but not historic. Then her voice filled the air, picked up perfectly by the microphones hidden in the ceiling. "Please, ma'am, give Daddy his job back. He cleans the floors so shiny they sparkle. He says buildings don't shine if people don't care. My daddy cares." Those words, unpolished and trembling with sincerity, shattered the polished rhythm of the building. The receptionist at the front desk bit her lip until it bled, then quietly saved the security feed to her phone. Later, when she uploaded it to her social account, she didn't even bother with a caption. She simply wrote, "This broke me." By noon, the video had already found its way into timelines across the city. By 2, it had been shared in a dozen languages. By dinner time, it was everywhere. A child standing in the lobby of a corporation too big to fail, pleading for her father's dignity. It was the kind of image that needed no explanation. Hashtags bloomed like wildflowers. #, give daddy his job back. Hashtag my daddy cares. #, shiny floors. Talk show hosts debated between commercial breaks. News anchors played the clip on repeat, their polished voices straining to hold back something dangerously close to emotion. In a world of automation and layoffs, one commentator mused, what does it mean when the human cost is measured by a child's plea? The footage wasn't just going viral. It was igniting something people hadn't felt in a long time. Outrage that was also tenderness, a reminder that behind every corporate decision was a human face, and sometimes that face was 6 years old, with messy hair and a trembling voice. At Orion Global, employees huddled in break rooms, whispering about the video. Some watched it in secret, tears pricking their eyes. Others watched it openly, anger bubbling in their chests. Many of them had never spoken to Jack Miller, but they knew him. He was the man who nodded at them in the hallways, who held doors open when their arms were full of papers, who polished the lobby floors until their reflections looked back at them like ghosts. Now they knew his daughter too. Meanwhile, in her corner office 50 floors above, Victoria Hale sat frozen. Her assistant had brought her the clip, face pale, fingers trembling around the tablet. "You should see this," he said softly. He pressed play. Victoria leaned back in her leather chair as the footage unfolded. She watched the child push past her guards. She heard the words echo through the speakers, raw and unpracticed. "My daddy cares." The assistant cleared his throat, ready to launch into a PR strategy, but Victoria didn't hear him. She was staring at the girl's face, so small, yet so certain. And for the first time in years, something cracked in her polished armor. She had faced boardroom betrayals, hostile takeovers, lawsuits that clawed at her reputation, and she had never once faltered. But a child's plea, simple, human, undeniable, was unraveling her in a way nothing else ever had. The city outside glittered, blind to the storm building inside her. On her desk sat the morning's financial reports, neat columns of profit and loss. They suddenly looked meaningless, because while numbers could be managed, spun, and hidden, that little girl's voice was unspinnable. It cut straight through every defense Victoria had spent a lifetime building. And though she would never admit it aloud, a single thought whispered in the quiet of her office, "What have I done?" The lobby of Orion Global was not a place for defiance. It was designed for compliance. Marble floors so polished they reflected your hesitation back at you. Glass walls that made you feel exposed from every angle, and a hush of controlled order that dared no one to speak louder than necessary. But that morning, in the middle of all that quiet power, a 6-year-old girl planted her sneakers on the marble and refused to move. 2 security guards approached her, Allen in the lead, his broad hand extended like a stop sign. He had dealt with protesters and press before, but this was different. The girl's fists were tight around the straps of her backpack, her braids slightly uneven. Her chin tilted higher than her small frame should have allowed. "All right now," Allen said carefully. "You need to come with us." He reached gently for her shoulder. "No." Her voice cracked, but did not waver. The sound startled everyone within earshot. "If you send me away, who will tell her the truth?" The crowd that had gathered, executives with steaming coffee cups, interns frozen with clipboards in hand, stopped pretending they weren't watching. They leaned in now, drawn to the fragile strength of the little figure standing her ground. Lily dug into her backpack and pulled out a folded piece of paper, edges bent from being carried too often. She held it up above her head with both hands, her voice rising with it. "This is my daddy." The drawing was crude, colorful, the kind only a child could make. Jack was there, stick figure tall, a mop in his hand, standing beside a towering building of glass that glittered with yellow crayon strokes. In the corner, a small girl with a pink backpack smiled up at him. "He's the reason your floors look like mirrors," Lily cried. "He makes them shine so people feel safe." "You can't fire mirrors." A hush rippled across the lobby. Some employees shifted uncomfortably. Others pressed their lips together, fighting back the sting of something they hadn't expected to feel at work: shame. One man near the elevator coughed into his fist. A young woman by the reception desk clapped once, almost instinctively, then stopped, embarrassed. But the sound seemed to break the dam. Another clap followed, then another, until a scattering of soft applause filled the marble hall. Alan crouched slightly, trying to meet Lily at eye level. "Sweetheart," he said, his tone careful, "you can't just come in here and—" But Lily cut him off, her small voice carrying more conviction than the polished speeches that echoed through those walls daily. "Grown-ups always say rules," she said, clutching her drawing to her chest. "But I say love, and love is more important." The words dropped like stones in still water, rippling out to every corner of the lobby. Executives glanced at one another, suddenly aware of the cameras overhead, aware of their own reflections in the marble floor, aware that they were being measured, not by stock prices, not by quarterly goals, but by a child who dared to speak what they had forgotten. Alan's mouth opened, but no words came. He looked at the little girl, then at the dozens of phones raised around them, capturing the moment in real time. Above, in a corner office, Victoria Hale watched the footage streaming live to her tablet. She had faced hostile shareholders and courtroom battles, but never this. A child, no taller than her desk, rewriting the rules of power in her lobby. Within hours, those words, "I say love, and love is more important," would flash across timelines, stitched into headlines, whispered in classrooms and coffee shops. The world wasn't watching a janitor's daughter anymore. They were watching a truth-teller too small for the suits around her, too pure for the excuses that had buried empathy in numbers. In that instant, Lily Miller stopped being just a child in a wrinkled uniform. She became the mirror her father had spent 12 years polishing, reflecting back to Orion Global and to the world the simple truth they had forgotten. Love makes the floor shine brighter than rules ever will. Victoria Hale had weathered storms most executives never survived. She had stared down rival CEOs across polished mahogany tables, parried accusations from reporters, silenced whispers of scandal before they could gather teeth. She built her empire on control, sharp, deliberate, absolute. Yet as she watched the footage replayed on the massive screens in the Orion Global lobby, she felt something she had not felt in years. A shift she could not command. The image was simple, unthreatening, absurd even. A little girl in a wrinkled school uniform standing in the center of her marble lobby, clutching a crayon drawing as if it were a weapon. But the tremor it sent through Victoria's chest was sharper than any boardroom attack. "Bring her up," Victoria said, her tone clipped. Her assistant blinked, hesitated. "Now," she added, the word final as glass. By the time Lily Miller was escorted into the elevator, the building buzzed with a tension that rippled from desk to desk. Employees whispered, phones lit up with news alerts, and strangers on the street pressed their faces to the glass windows, hoping to catch a glimpse of the child who had dared to scold the untouchable Orion Global. The 40th floor was quiet when the elevator doors opened. Lily stepped out between two nervous security guards, her sneakers squeaking against the immaculate floor. Her hands clutched her backpack straps so tightly her knuckles whitened, but her chin stayed up. She had never seen ceilings so high, or windows that swallowed an entire skyline, but she didn't let the size of the place shrink her. The guards led her into the heart of Victoria Hale's office, and the doors closed behind her with a soft hiss. The room was vast, lined with books she couldn't read, and awards that gleamed like trophies from another world. The desk alone looked bigger than her kitchen table at home. Victoria sat behind it, perfectly composed, her dark suit pressed, her blonde hair pinned without a strand, out of place. She did not rise. She studied the child in front of her the way she might study a potential acquisition, measuring, weighing, dissecting. Lily stared back, her eyes wide, not with fear, but with awe tangled tightly to determination. The silence stretched. Then she spoke, her voice small but steady. "Are you the lady who took my daddy's job?" The question didn't echo in the room, but it landed heavier than any accusation Victoria had ever heard in a courtroom. It wasn't barbed with jargon or softened by diplomacy. It was raw, naked, unanswerable. For the first time in years, Victoria didn't have a response waiting on her tongue. She opened her mouth, closed it again. She could recite quarterly figures, explain automation, blame restructuring. She could say it's not personal, the phrase she had used so many times it had become her shield. But the words withered before they could leave her lips. How could she explain to a child that her father was nothing more than a line on a balance sheet? Lily shifted her weight but didn't look away. She pulled the folded crayon drawing from her backpack and placed it gently on the edge of Victoria's desk. The CEO glanced down. A stick figure stood beside a towering building of yellow glass. Beside him, a little girl with a pink backpack smiled up at him. Above them, in uneven letters, Lily had written, "My Daddy Cares." Victoria felt something twist in her chest. She had built her career on keeping her heart barricaded, on never letting memory bleed into business. But the sight of that drawing pulled at a door she thought she had locked forever. She remembered her own mother's calloused hands scrubbing floors, the nights they ate canned beans by candlelight because the power had been cut. She had clawed her way out of that life by refusing to be vulnerable, by promising herself she would never again be powerless. Yet here she was, undone by a piece of paper colored outside the lines. Lily's voice broke the silence again. "He didn't do anything wrong," she whispered. "He just made your floors shine." "Why did you make him sad?" Victoria's throat tightened. Across decades of hardened strategy, of late-night deals and empty penthouses, no one had ever asked her that question, not like this. And for the first time she realized she had no prepared answer. Jack Miller sat hunched over the kitchen table, the same table where he had once balanced Lily's coloring books beside his coffee mug, the same table where Rachel had laughed over burnt pancakes years before she was gone. Tonight it was covered in bills, red-stamped envelopes, overdue notices, payment reminders stacked like accusations. The numbers blurred together until they stopped meaning anything. Rent, utilities, medical debt, groceries, the cruel arithmetic of survival. He pressed his thumb against his temple, trying to push away the pounding in his head. He had told Lily what he thought was enough, that jobs weren't always fair, that sometimes the world took without asking, that grown-ups carried burdens children shouldn't have to see. He had hoped she'd forget his tight voice, the way he lingered too long staring at the darkened skyline outside her bedroom window. She was 6. She deserved stories, not scarcity. He never imagined she'd try to carry the weight herself. A sharp knock rattled the door. Jack pushed back his chair, weary, expecting a delivery, or maybe the landlord with another reminder he couldn't answer. Instead, when he opened the door, Mrs. Carter stood there, his neighbor from across the hall, cheeks flushed, phone clutched tight in her hands. Her voice came out quick, almost trembling. "Jack, isn't this your Lily?" He frowned, confused, until she held the phone up. The glow of the screen lit her face, and then he saw it. His little girl standing in the middle of Orion Global's marble lobby, braids loose, backpack slipping off her shoulder, her chin raised, her voice strong despite the tremor. "Please, ma'am, give Daddy his job back. He cleans the floors so shiny they sparkle. He says buildings don't shine if people don't care. My Daddy cares." The words hit him like a blow to the chest. Pride swelled, fierce and undeniable, but terror came crashing right behind it. His knees went weak. The video played again, looping, showing his daughter lifting her crayon drawing like a banner, phones aimed at her, guards circling her, strangers gasping in the background. "Dear God," he whispered. He could hardly breathe. He had wanted to protect her from this world, and instead she had marched straight into it, carrying his name on her small shoulders. Mrs. Carter bit her lip. "It's all over the internet, Jack. She's everywhere." Jack's hands shook as he grabbed his jacket from the hook by the door. He didn't stop to tie his boots. "I need to go," he muttered, more to himself than her. "Go where?" she asked, startled. "To get her," he said. His voice cracked, and he didn't try to hide it. He bolted down the stairs 2 at a time, his breath ragged in his chest. On the street, the city felt louder than usual. Horns blaring, voices carrying, neon lights burning sharp against the evening gloom. But Jack barely saw it. All he could picture was Lily, his Lily, standing too small in a place too big, her voice trembling but brave. Pride warred with fear inside him. Pride because she had spoken the truth he had buried for years, the truth he hadn't had the courage to speak aloud. Fear because the world wasn't gentle with truth-tellers, especially not when they were 6 years old, with crayons instead of armor. What if she got hurt? What if someone laughed at her? What if this moment, this video, followed her forever, stealing the chance for her to have a childhood untouched by shame? Jack pushed harder through the crowded street, whispering to himself like a prayer. Please, God, let me get there before they break her spirit. He had survived deployments, layoffs, loss, nights of silence so heavy it crushed the air from his lungs. But none of it compared to the thought of his daughter standing alone under that ceiling of glass, facing down the kind of power he had spent his whole life shrinking beneath. He didn't care about the cameras or the headlines or what Victoria Hale thought of him now. He cared about Lily and the fire she carried that he feared the world would try to extinguish. And as he ran, one truth burned inside him, brighter than all the city lights combined. If his daughter was brave enough to fight for him, then he had no right to keep living in silence. Tonight, it was his turn to fight for her. The office was silent except for the faint hum of the city far below, muted through the glass walls. Victoria Hale leaned forward in her chair, elbows resting lightly on the mahogany desk. She studied the small figure across from her with the same focus she brought to negotiations that had shifted entire markets. Normally, that kind of scrutiny unsettled people. Seasoned executives faltered under it, venture capitalists squirmed, politicians hedged their words. But the girl in front of her, 6 years old, hair braided unevenly, backpack straps clutched in white-knuckled fists, didn't flinch. Victoria narrowed her eyes as if she could read Lily Miller the way she read financial reports. "Do you love your daddy?" she asked at last, her voice even, controlled, testing. Lily's eyes filled with tears, but her voice did not waver. "He's my best friend," she whispered. Then louder, steadier. "He reads me bedtime stories. He makes pancakes on Saturdays. And he says shiny floors mean people feel safe." She drew in a shaky breath, her chest rising and falling. "Why would you take safe away?" The question landed like a stone dropped into water, sending ripples through the pristine room. Victoria's assistant, standing near the bookshelves lined with crystal awards, shifted uneasily. Even the walls themselves seemed to shrink under the weight of those words. Victoria kept her posture rigid, though something in her chest twisted. Emotions, she reminded herself, were weaknesses. She had built her empire by rejecting them, brick by brick, decision by decision. Every time life tried to soften her, she hardened instead. That was the cost of survival. "The company has rules," she began carefully, her voice measured, her tone rehearsed. Lily stamped her little sneaker against the polished floor, the sound sharp and startling in the stillness. "Rules don't hug you when you're scared. Rules don't fix your toys." Her small hand tightened around the crayon drawing she carried. "People do. My daddy does." Victoria's carefully arranged composure trembled for the first time in years. She blinked once, quickly, as though she could sweep the weight of those words away. But she couldn't. The image of Jack Miller, a man she didn't even know by name until today, swept through her mind, uninvited. She imagined him polishing the very glass she used as a shield, his hands moving across surfaces she never noticed, his silence covering cracks she never acknowledged. Lily's face burned with earnestness. She wasn't asking for charity. She wasn't even asking for herself. She was defending him, her voice too small for the vastness of the office, yet somehow big enough to rattle its foundations. Victoria looked at her assistant, who stared at the floor like the wood grain had suddenly become fascinating. No one in the room seemed prepared for this clash, not of law or strategy, but of worlds colliding. A child who only knew love as her currency, and a woman who had spent her life trading everything but. For a moment, Victoria thought of her own childhood, of nights when she lay awake, listening to her mother's weary sighs, waiting for comfort that never came. She thought of the promise she made back then, never to need anyone, never to let love make her vulnerable. Yet here was this girl, showing her the fragility and strength of love in one breath. Her lips parted, but no sound came. The rehearsed speeches, the tidy explanations, all of them dissolved in the air between them. She wasn't looking at a child anymore. She was looking at truth, unvarnished and braided, staring back at her without apology. And for the first time in her career, Victoria Hale felt something she couldn't outmaneuver, couldn't silence, couldn't explain away. She felt herself falter. Jack's chest was burning by the time he reached the revolving doors of Orion Global. He had run harder than he'd run in years, lungs scraping for air, sweat dampening his shirt. The guards at the front stepped forward, hands already half raised, but then one of them caught sight of the faded ID badge still clipped to Jack's jacket. It had been deactivated the moment his job was cut, but recognition flickered in the guard's eyes. He hesitated, then nodded. "Go," he muttered. Jack didn't waste time with thanks. He pushed through the lobby, ignoring the stairs, ignoring the phones that were still raised to capture every angle of the circus his daughter had started. His boots struck the marble with a weight that felt more like desperation than defiance. The elevator ride to the 40th floor was a blur. His heart pounded in his ears, faster with each second, until the doors slid open and spilled him into the polished silence of executive power. He didn't knock. He burst into the CEO's office, breath ragged, eyes scanning the room. And there she was, Lily, his little girl, standing in the center of a world too big for her, her chin lifted as if she had been born for this fight. At the massive desk, Victoria Hale leaned back in her leather chair, hands steepled, studying Lily, not like a nuisance, but like a riddle she hadn't solved yet. Jack's throat clenched. "I'm so sorry," he blurted, voice raw, cracking under the weight of everything he wanted to protect. "She didn't mean to—" Victoria raised a hand, cutting him off. She meant every word. The room went still. Jack froze mid-step, his chest heaving. Instinct screamed at him to apologize again, to retreat, to sweep his daughter away from this place before her innocence was swallowed whole. But before he could move, Lily slipped her small hand into his. Her fingers curled tight, steadying him in a way he hadn't expected. "Daddy?" she whispered, her eyes shining. "I told her about you. I told her you care." Jack's breath caught. He looked down at her, then back at the woman who held his future in a single raised eyebrow. His voice came out low but steady. "I don't want pity," he said. "I just want to work, to take care of her." Victoria's gaze flicked from Lily to Jack, then back again. For the briefest fraction of a second, something cracked through her polished mask. Her eyes softened, almost imperceptibly, but enough that Jack noticed. And in that instant, something long buried stirred within her, something she had spent years pretending didn't exist. Compassion. The silence stretched. Jack felt it pressing against him, heavy as the city outside. He thought of Rachel, of the promises he had made to keep Lily safe, of the shame of being invisible for so long. He stood taller, though his legs trembled. Victoria tapped a finger against the desk, as if testing herself more than him. "You care," she repeated quietly, her gaze lingering on Lily's crayon drawing now lying on the corner of her desk. "And she believes you." Jack swallowed hard, his hand tightening around his daughter's. "Because it's true." For a moment, none of them moved. The powerful CEO, the janitor without a job, and the child who had brought them together like opposing forces colliding in a single room. The city hummed beyond the glass walls, but inside the world held its breath. And for the first time, Jack saw not the woman on magazine covers, not the ice of Orion Global, but a person, someone who, despite herself, was beginning to listen. The boardroom at Orion Global had been designed to intimidate. A table of polished glass stretched nearly the length of the room, so spotless it reflected the anxious faces gathered around it. Floor-to-ceiling windows poured light across the skyline, a reminder that power sat here, not in the streets below. Executives shifted in their leather chairs, voices sharp, clipped, impatient. They were used to numbers, not children with crayons. By midweek, the viral video had reached every corner of the internet. Talk shows dissected it, journalists replayed it, and investors sent nervous messages wanting reassurance that their money wasn't tethered to a scandal. And now the board wanted blood, someone to blame, someone to silence. "This is a PR nightmare," snapped Collins, head of corporate strategy. He slammed his palm against the reflective surface, rattling the glasses of water lined neatly in front of them. "We cannot appear weak. If we backtrack on this, it sets a precedent. Every layoff becomes negotiable if you parade a child in front of cameras." Across from him, Ramirez, head of public relations, adjusted her glasses, her tone icy but deliberate. "And if we double down? If we attack the narrative? Then we look heartless. The world isn't siding with us, they're siding with her. That little girl is on every screen in America. Her drawing has been painted on protest signs. Do you want to be remembered as the board that crushed a janitor's daughter?" The arguments flew like arrows, each sharper than the last. One executive worried about investors fleeing. Another warned of stock prices dipping. A third muttered about liability, precedent, chaos. The room vibrated with their fear disguised as outrage. At the head of the table sat Victoria Hale, hands folded neatly, her face unreadable. She had heard every argument before, in different forms with different stakes. But she wasn't hearing them now. She wasn't thinking about stock prices or quarterly forecasts. She was thinking about Lily Miller's voice, soft but steady, saying, "Rules don't hug you when you're scared." She was thinking about Jack Miller, standing in her office with his shoulders squared despite the weight of humiliation pressing against him, saying, "I just want to work, to take care of her." "What's our official stance?" Collins demanded, his voice rising with exasperation. "We need a press release, a strategy, something." The room turned toward her. Dozens of eyes, sharp and expectant, waited for the woman who had built Orion Global into an empire of glass and steel to remind them what mattered. Profit, control, dominance. That was her role. That was what they were certain she would deliver. Instead, Victoria leaned back slightly, her gaze cool but steady. "Our stance," she said evenly, her voice cutting through the noise like a blade through silk, "is that people matter, even janitors." The words hung in the air, heavier than anything that had come before them. For a moment no one moved. Then the board erupted. Some voices rose in outrage, insisting she had lost her mind, that sentiment would ruin them. Others sighed with relief, almost grateful someone had finally said aloud what their consciences had whispered in the dark. Victoria didn't flinch. She didn't raise her voice to argue or justify. She simply sat at the head of the gleaming table, the city sprawling behind her. And for the first time in years, she didn't care what the balance sheet said. She cared about the truth, the unshakable, inconvenient truth that had walked into her lobby with a pink backpack and fire in her eyes. As the board bickered, she thought of something her mother once said when life was cruel and unrelenting. Some things can't be measured, not in dollars, not in rules, only in what kind of person you decide to be. Victoria Hale, the woman made of steel and glass, had finally decided. And for once, she chose people over profit. The video was no longer just a clip from a security feed. It had become a symbol, a spark that caught fire in places no PR strategy could reach. In downtown alleys, artists painted murals of Lily Miller, her small hand holding up that crayon drawing like a shield. The colors were bold, childlike, defiant. Strangers stopped to take photos, posting them with captions about dignity, about truth, about fathers who worked too hard to ever be seen. Journalists crowded outside the Miller apartment building, cameras waiting for Jack to step outside. When they finally caught him, he stood on the cracked sidewalk, his daughter's small fingers tangled in his. "This isn't about me," he told them, his voice steady but worn. "It's about doing what's right." He refused to let them turn him into a spectacle, but the refusal only made him more compelling. Letters began arriving in the mailroom of Orion Global, handwritten notes from families across the country, photos of children holding signs scrawled with markers. "My daddy matters too. My mommy matters too. We matter." Some envelopes held drawings that mirrored Lily's, stick figures with mops, vacuum cleaners, name tags, drawings of invisible parents brought into the light by children who couldn't spell corporation, but understood what it meant to be overlooked. The world wasn't just watching anymore, it was participating. At night, in her penthouse high above the city, Victoria Hale scrolled through the coverage. Her suite was as pristine as her public image, glass tables, cold marble, art that whispered of wealth rather than warmth. She sat barefoot on a leather couch, a glass of wine untouched beside her, the glow of her tablet washing her face in pale light. Every headline seemed to cut deeper than the last. The janitor's daughter who shook corporate America. 6-year-old holds CEO accountable. Orion Global faces its reflection. The words weren't just about her company. They were about her. But what haunted her wasn't the criticism. She had faced worse. She had been painted as ruthless, cold, merciless, and she had worn those labels like armor. What she couldn't ignore, what kept her awake long after midnight, was the image of Jack Miller, holding his daughter's hand. The way his eyes softened when he looked at her, the warmth that radiated in something as simple as a gesture. Victoria scrolled back to a still frame from the video. Jack's hand, calloused and rough, curled protectively around Lily's smaller one, her face tilted up toward him, brimming with belief. And his gaze met hers with something Victoria couldn't name at first. Not pride exactly, not possession, something steadier, purer. Trust. She stared at that image until her chest ached. She tried to remember the last time anyone had looked at her like that, without calculation, without expectation, without agenda. She couldn't. Her life had become a fortress built of accolades and accomplishments. People admired her, envied her, feared her. But love? That was something she had put away long ago, locked in a room she never entered. And now, because of a janitor's daughter, that locked door rattled in its hinges. For the first time in decades, Victoria admitted something she had buried beneath layers of glass and steel. She was lonely, achingly, terrifyingly lonely. The kind of loneliness no award could polish away, no quarterly success could mask. She closed the tablet, but the images burned behind her eyes. A little girl with fire in her voice, a father with quiet dignity in his hands, and a world, watching, waiting to see what she would do next. The city outside her windows glittered like it always did, millions of lights pretending to be stars. But Victoria Hale had never felt so small beneath them. The executive dining hall was never meant for people like Jack Miller. Its chandeliers dripped with crystal, its windows framed the skyline like a living portrait, and every table gleamed as though polished by the weight of power itself. Usually it was a place for whispered deals and careful laughter, not for janitors and their daughters. Yet on that quiet afternoon, Victoria Hale had requested exactly that. Lunch, not negotiations, no cameras, no board members. Just the three of them at a long table meant for 20. Staff hovered at the edges, their whispers a current just beneath the clink of silverware. They weren't used to this, the CEO dining with a man who once cleaned their offices and a little girl with hair tied up in crooked braids. But Lily didn't seem to notice. She sat comfortably in her chair, swinging her legs, munching happily on a plate of chicken nuggets Victoria had ordered, especially when she saw the menu was too stiff for a child's appetite. Jack sat straighter than he ever had, his tie slightly askew, his eyes cautious as though the room might reject him at any moment. He cut into his food with slow precision, clearly more concerned with not embarrassing himself than with the meal. Victoria, by contrast, moved with her usual elegance, though her mind wasn't on the roasted salmon before her. She kept watching the little girl who seemed to dismantle every wall she'd built just by existing. Halfway through the meal, Lily looked up mid-bite, crumbs dusting her fingers, and asked the question that no journalist, no investor, no rival had ever dared to. "Do you have a daddy?" The fork paused halfway to Victoria's mouth. For a moment her practiced composure faltered. She lowered it slowly, buying time, but Lily's gaze was unflinching, innocent in its curiosity, yet sharp enough to slice straight through her defenses. "I did," Victoria said finally. Her voice was calm, but there was a catch in it she couldn't smooth out. "He left when I was your age." Lily frowned as if that answer alone was unacceptable. "So who read you bedtime stories?" The room seemed to tighten around the question. Even Jack froze, his knife resting against his plate. Victoria felt her throat constrict. She stared at the silver patterns in the tablecloth, searching for refuge, but there was none. "No one," she admitted, her voice softer now, stripped of its usual steel. Silence wrapped around the table. The whispers from the staff stopped. Even the city outside seemed to pause. Jack lowered his gaze, but not before Victoria caught the flicker of something in his eyes. Not pity, but recognition, as though he understood what it meant to grow up carrying the absence of someone who should have stayed. Then, with the simple certainty only a child could offer, Lily slid the cookie from her plate across the table. "You can borrow my daddy sometimes," she said. "He's really good at stories." Jack nearly dropped his fork. His chest tightened with both pride and ache. He opened his mouth to speak, to gently redirect her, but the words caught. Victoria blinked hard, her perfectly crafted mask cracking as her vision blurred. Tears threatened, hot and uninvited, pressing at the corners of her eyes. She had built her life on the refusal to cry, on the belief that tears were currency she couldn't afford. And yet here, in the middle of the executive dining hall, with the city at her feet and power stacked neatly in her favor, she felt undone by the generosity of a child offering what she had never dared to ask for. She swallowed, steadied herself, and managed a faint smile. "That's very kind of you," she whispered. Lily grinned, satisfied, and went back to her nuggets as though she hadn't just shaken the foundation of a woman who thought herself unshakable. Jack glanced at Victoria, unsure what to say, but in her eyes, glassy, vulnerable, he saw something he never expected. Not the CEO who signed papers that erased his job. Not the woman the world painted in steel and glass. But a person, fragile and human, finally remembering what it felt like to long for something as simple as a bedtime story. The plates had been cleared, though none of them had eaten much after Lily's startling questions. The dining hall felt quieter now, almost reverent, the chandeliers above glinting in soft light rather than their usual show of grandeur. Jack sat stiffly, his calloused hands folded on the table, still unsure if he belonged in a room like this. Lily swung her legs from her chair, humming softly, crumbs of cookie still clinging to her fingers. And Victoria Hale, the woman who commanded skyscrapers and headlines, was watching them both as though something inside her had settled on an answer she hadn't expected. She leaned forward, her tone calm but firm. "Jack," she said, her gaze steady on him, "I want to offer you your job back." Relief flooded Jack's face before he could stop it, shoulders sagging as though he'd been holding his breath since the day he carried that box of belongings out of the building. But before gratitude could escape his lips, Victoria lifted a hand, stopping him gently. "Not as janitor," she continued, "as facility supervisor, full benefits, a proper salary, and flexibility for Lily." The words hung in the air, weighty and unreal. Jack blinked, his mouth opening and closing, but nothing came out. For a man used to swallowing disappointment, this moment felt too sharp to trust. He leaned back slightly, his voice barely above a whisper. "Why me?" Victoria's eyes softened. The answer came slowly, carefully, but without hesitation. "Because you didn't just clean floors, Jack. You built safety. You built trust. This building doesn't shine because of glass and marble. It shines because someone cared enough to see it through. You cared." She glanced toward Lily, who was leaning against her father's arm, wide-eyed with expectation. "And because your daughter reminded me that greatness doesn't always wear a suit." Jack's hands trembled against the table. He wasn't used to being seen, not like this. For 12 years, he had been a shadow moving silently in the margins of power. To have the CEO herself strip away the invisibility he had lived with, it was almost too much. His throat tightened, and he found himself staring at the polished glassware just to avoid drowning in the weight of her words. Beside him, Lily broke into a grin, her small voice carrying into the silence. "Told you, Daddy," she whispered proudly. "You just needed to shine where people could see." Jack turned to her, eyes damp, lips pressed tight in an effort to hold himself together. He reached out, brushing a strand of hair from her forehead, his hand trembling against the softness of her skin. "You're braver than me," he said quietly. Victoria caught the exchange, and something in her chest stirred again, an ache she hadn't realized had been waiting. She thought of her own childhood, of nights with no bedtime stories, no gentle hand brushing her hair away. Watching them, she felt both envy and longing, but also something else, respect. Jack finally looked back at her. "I don't know what to say." "You don't have to say anything," Victoria replied. "Just take the offer. Let us fix what we broke." For the first time since stepping into her office, Jack allowed himself a small smile, uneven, raw but real. "Thank you," he murmured, though the words felt too small for the moment. Lily clapped her hands once, delighted, as though she'd been expecting nothing less. "Does this mean we can get ice cream after?" she asked, her voice cutting through the weight of the room like sunlight through storm clouds. Jack laughed, the sound rough but genuine, and Victoria found herself smiling too, a smile that wasn't rehearsed or calculated, but born from the rare sight of something true. For the first time in a long time, the dining hall didn't feel like a fortress of wealth. It felt like a place where something new had just been built, not with glass or steel, but with trust, offered and accepted across a table meant for power. Greg Marsh didn't bother to knock. The heavy glass doors to Victoria Hale's office swung inward with a violent shove, rattling against the stopper. His face was flushed, jaw clenched, his tailored suit looking more like armor than clothing. Papers trembled in his hand, though whether from anger or fear even he couldn't tell. "You can't do this," he spat, the words slicing through the stillness of the 40-story view. Victoria looked up from her desk with the calm of a woman who had seen storms try and fail to topple her. She didn't flinch. She didn't even blink. Her pen hovered briefly above the page she had been signing before she set it down deliberately. "Do what, Greg?" she asked evenly, her voice carrying more weight for its quietness. Greg tossed the folder onto her desk. "Elevating a janitor undermines everything we stand for. Facility supervisor, benefits, flexibility. This isn't Charity Week, Victoria. This is Orion Global." Victoria leaned back in her chair, the leather creaking softly. She regarded him the way she might a chess opponent who had overplayed his hand. "And what exactly do we stand for, Greg?" she asked, her tone sharp enough to cut the air. "Spreadsheets? Profit margins? Or people?" The silence stretched between them. Greg faltered for a fraction of a second, then recovered, his voice rising as he tried to fill the space. "Optics matter. The board is already skittish after the video. If we make this man a symbol, if we validate his daughter's stunt, it sends the wrong message. It tells the world emotions can dictate policy. It tells employees that tears are stronger than contracts." Victoria's eyes hardened. "And maybe they are," she said simply. Greg blinked, stunned. "Excuse me?" "For years we've hidden behind numbers and called it strength. Victoria continued, her voice building, not in volume but in force. But truth matters more than optics. And the truth is, a little girl with crayons showed more courage in our lobby than most of us have in this boardroom. Greg's mouth tightened, his knuckles whitening as he gripped the back of a chair. "This isn't you," he hissed. "This sentimentality. You don't build empires by indulging sob stories. You built this company by being untouchable, ruthless. And look where it's gotten us," Victoria snapped, her composure cracking just enough to reveal the fire beneath. An empire of glass, where one child's voice was enough to shatter it. Maybe it needed to shatter. For the first time in her career, she wasn't playing chess. She wasn't maneuvering, calculating, or arranging the next 3 moves. She was playing heart, raw and unguarded. Greg straightened, his jaw tight. He wasn't used to losing ground, especially not in this office. "The board won't back this. Investors won't back this. And when it falls apart, don't say I didn't warn you." Victoria rose from her chair. She was taller than he remembered. Or maybe it was just the weight of conviction that made her presence so much larger. She stepped around the desk, her heels clicking against the marble, until she stood face to face with him. "Then let them not back it," she said coldly. "I won't build my legacy on silence and fear. If this company can't stand for people, then it stands for nothing." Greg's lips pressed into a thin line. He gathered his papers with jerky precision and turned on his heel. The door slammed behind him, leaving the office heavy with the echo of conflict. Victoria stood still, staring out at the city through the glass. She knew Greg wouldn't stop here. He was too ambitious, too threatened by anything he couldn't control. He would whisper in ears, stir doubt, rally resistance. Change never came without enemies. But for the first time in her life, Victoria didn't feel afraid of them. She felt alive. The auditorium smelled faintly of fresh coffee and polished wood, the kind of space usually reserved for quarterly updates and carefully rehearsed speeches about growth and efficiency. Rows of chairs stretched toward the stage, filled with executives in pressed suits, assistants clutching notepads, cleaners still in their uniforms, and staff from every corner of the building. It wasn't often Orion Global gathered like this. Today felt different, charged, expectant. Victoria Hale stood off to the side of the stage, her posture straight, her gaze unreadable. She had spoken first, her introduction brief, her words carrying an unusual softness as she explained why she had called them all together. Then she turned to Jack Miller and nodded. "Would you come up?" Jack's legs felt heavy as he climbed the steps. He wasn't used to stages, to spotlights, to rooms full of people waiting for his voice. His suit hung slightly loose on his frame, borrowed from his neighbor, who had insisted he couldn't show up in his maintenance uniform. His shoes were scuffed, his palms slick with sweat. He looked out at the crowd, faces that had passed him for years without ever truly seeing him, and felt the weight of silence pressing down. He cleared his throat once, then again, the microphone catching even the smallest sound. "I've been invisible here for a long time," he began. His voice was rough at first, but steady. "But invisibility doesn't mean you stop caring." The room was still, waiting. Jack's gaze swept across the crowd, landing on people he had walked past countless times. Executives who never learned his name, assistants who had smiled politely but hurried on, janitors who nodded to him in shared silence. He took a breath. "Every floor I mopped, every light I changed. I did it because I believed people deserved safe, clean places to work. Not because it was glamorous, because it mattered." A murmur rippled through the room, not disagreement, but recognition, a subtle shift as his words reached places numbers never could. Jack's eyes flicked to the front row, where Lily sat with her legs swinging, her pink sneakers a bright spot against the dark carpet. She looked at him with that fierce, unwavering trust that had carried her into the lobby that morning, the trust that had turned their lives upside down. He felt his throat tighten, but he pressed on. "My daughter reminded me of something I'd forgotten. he said, his voice thickening. She reminded me that even when no one sees you, love sees you. And sometimes that's enough to change everything. A hush lingered after his words, the kind of pause that feels like the whole world inhaling at once. Then, slowly, it broke. Applause began at the back, spreading forward like a wave, not the polite tapping reserved for obligatory speeches, but something deeper, genuine, thunderous, alive. People stood one by one until the whole room was on its feet. Jack swallowed hard, his chest aching in a way that felt both painful and liberating. For once, he wasn't the man sweeping quietly in the background. For once, the invisible man wasn't invisible anymore. Victoria watched from the side, her hands clasped, her eyes glinting with something she hadn't shown in years. Pride, perhaps, or maybe relief. She knew this moment wasn't just about Jack. It was about all the people who had been made to feel small, who had carried weight in silence, who had been told their work was invisible when in truth it was the foundation holding everything together. On stage, Jack stepped back from the microphone, overwhelmed by the sound rising around him. He didn't bow, didn't wave, didn't bask in it. He simply looked at Lily, who grinned up at him with her whole face, and he smiled back. That was enough. The applause roared on, filling every corner of Orion Global with the truth a child had forced them all to hear. People matter. The applause from the all-staff meeting still echoed faintly in Victoria's ears as she stepped back into her office. The glass walls reflected the fading afternoon light, stretching shadows across the polished floor. She closed the door softly behind her, the sudden quiet pressing down like a weight. Jack followed a few steps behind, uncertain, his borrowed suit still rumpled from nerves, his face still flushed from the ovation he hadn't known how to receive. Lily had gone with a kind secretary to get ice cream, leaving the two of them in a silence neither quite knew how to break. Victoria walked to the window, her heels clicking against the floor, and placed her hands on the glass. The city sprawled beneath them, endless and glittering, but for once she didn't feel taller than it. She felt smaller, fragile, like the glass might shatter beneath her fingertips. Without turning, she said quietly, "You should know something, Jack. Your daughter saved me too." He frowned, confused, his brow knitting. "Saved you?" She turned then, and for the first time since he'd met her, her posture wasn't perfect. Her mask wasn't in place. Her shoulders sagged slightly, her eyes softer, tired. "Loneliness has a way of hardening people," she said. "I let it harden me. I stopped believing in kindness a long time ago, stopped trusting it. Every time I thought I could, it cost me something. So I learned to keep everything out. Love, trust, softness. Because it was safer that way. Success became easier than people." Jack said nothing, but the weight of his silence filled the room. She went on, her voice lower now, almost fragile. "But when Lily walked into this building, holding that drawing, demanding to be heard, she reminded me of someone I used to be. I was once a little girl who wanted love too, and I buried her. I told myself she didn't matter if I wanted to survive." The admission trembled between them. Victoria's throat tightened, but she refused to look away. She had faced judges, investors, rivals, never faltered. Yet standing in front of a janitor who had spent most of his career scrubbing her floors, she felt more vulnerable than she had in decades. Jack finally moved, easing into the chair across from her desk. He didn't interrupt, didn't try to fill the space with empty words. He simply looked at her, and in his gaze was no judgment, no triumph, only quiet understanding. That silence broke something open in her. She swallowed, her voice roughening. "I didn't realize how badly I needed to be reminded. That people aren't numbers, that I'm not just this." She gestured vaguely at the office, at the sprawling view, at the empire she had spent her life constructing. "I've been an icon for so long that I forgot what it meant to just be human. And your daughter—" She shook her head, a rare, helpless smile ghosting across her lips. She walked in and tore through all the walls I thought were impenetrable. Jack leaned back slightly, his eyes steady, his expression unreadable but not cold. He knew what it was to carry loneliness, to armor yourself with silence. He didn't need to say it. She saw it in him. His quiet wasn't dismissal, it was recognition. For the first time in decades, Victoria felt the weight of her own humanity settle onto her shoulders, not as a weakness, but as something she had been starving for. She wasn't a CEO in that moment, not an icon, not a headline, just a woman who had been waiting too long to be seen. She exhaled slowly and lowered her gaze. "So yes," she said softly, "your daughter saved you. But she saved me too." The room was silent again, but this time it wasn't heavy. It was full. And for the first time, Victoria Hale allowed herself to believe she didn't have to face that silence alone. Months passed, and Orion Global no longer felt like the same company. The air in the building had changed, not because the marble floors gleamed brighter or the glass towers caught more sunlight, but because people moved through the halls differently. There was laughter, where once there had been only hurried footsteps. There were conversations between those who used to pass each other like shadows. The walls still stood tall, the ceiling still soared, but something warmer lived inside them now. Policies shifted first in small ways. The overnight staff received health care for the first time. The break rooms, once barren and forgotten, were stocked and renovated. The janitorial crew was no longer hidden in the basement. Their lounge overlooked the skyline, the same view executives once hoarded for themselves. Departments that had been separated by power now sat together in open forums, voices blending where they once would have been silenced. At the center of it all was Jack Miller. His suit still felt a little foreign on his shoulders, but his role no longer did. As facility supervisor, he carried a new badge, but his pride came not from the title, rather from what he did with it. He mentored the younger staff, men and women who reminded him of himself a decade ago, quiet, overlooked, ready to vanish into the corners of a world that never saw them. Jack taught them that dignity wasn't tied to a desk or a title. It was in the care you poured into your work, in the way you left a room safer and kinder than you found it. Victoria Hale had changed too. She visited the maintenance wing often, not with a clipboard in hand, not to demand updates, but simply to listen. Sometimes she walked in and found Jack surrounded by staff swapping stories, and she lingered at the edge, content just to hear voices that once would never have reached her. Other times, she sat quietly with a cup of coffee, and the workers joined her as though she were no different from them. For a woman who had once thrived on being untouchable, she had discovered the quiet strength of touch, handshakes, laughter, presence. And then there was Lily. The little girl with the crooked braids and the pink backpack had become something of a legend within the glass walls. Executives stopped her in the hall to ask about her drawings, and employees lit up when they heard her laughter echoing across the lobby. She carried no title, no responsibility, yet she had become the unofficial mascot of Orion Global. A reminder of why the changes mattered, a reminder of what had started it all. One late afternoon, the building was bathed in the orange glow of the setting sun. The glass towers shimmered, and the lobby reflected the light in warm, golden tones. Jack stood across the hall with a group of staff, his laughter carrying easily, the sound deep and unburdened in a way it hadn't been for years. He looked comfortable, like a man who had finally found his place. Lily tugged gently on Victoria's sleeve. She had been standing beside her, sketchbook in hand, doodling as always. Victoria looked down, and Lily's wide eyes studied her with the same curiosity that had once toppled the walls of a fortress made of steel. "Are you happy now?" Lily asked, her voice soft but certain. The question caught Victoria off guard. It wasn't the kind of thing investors asked her, or journalists, or board members. It wasn't about growth, or power, or image. It was about something she hadn't allowed herself to name in years. She turned her gaze toward Jack, watching him tease one of the younger workers, his smile genuine, his shoulders free of the weight that had once bent him low. She saw the way people leaned into him, not because of his job, but because of his presence. And then, for the first time in longer than she could remember, Victoria smiled. Not the rehearsed smile that had graced magazine covers, not the strategic one she used in negotiations. A real one. The kind that came from somewhere deep, untouched by performance. "Yes," she whispered to Lily, "because someone finally taught me that love can make even the tallest towers shine." The little girl grinned and slipped her hand into Victoria's, and together they stood in the fading light, watching a building that once symbolized power become something far greater. Human. If this story touched your heart, take a moment to share your thoughts in the comments. Where in the world are you watching from? And don't forget to hit subscribe, because tomorrow's story will remind you just how powerful love and courage can be.